We've got correspondents all over, up and down the East Coast. Kristen Welker's outside the Manhattan courthouse. Vaughn Hillyard's down at Mar-a-Lago, and we've got everybody else in between here in D.C. Our Justice and Intelligence correspondent, Ken Dilanian. Also with us, Dan Horwitz, a former Manhattan District Attorney. He's here to answer all these questions that we are still scratching our heads about. And in a moment, I'll be joined on set here by Chuck Rosenberg, a former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official. But let's start with our correspondents, Kristen Welker, outside in the Manhattan courthouse. So, Kristen, I have to say, the president called for this big protest, called for all of this. It doesn't sound like there was much of a protest. If anything, it sounded like more of the president's detractors showed up than supporters.
Yeah, Chuck, it was pretty remarkable. There were a couple of hundred people gathered sort of to this park outside of the courthouse. Some of them were supporters of former President Trump. A lot of them were his detractors. It was a largely peaceful crowd, and what really struck me is that the crowd kind of reflected this somber day from the moment that Mr. Trump entered the courthouse behind me to face those 34 felony counts that you just laid out. The crowd was pretty silent throughout the day, kind of reflecting the heaviness and the weight of this moment for this country. You saw that, I think, in Mr. Trump's face as he sat there, that first image that we got from the courtroom of Mr. Trump kind of listening to the proceedings get underway. And then, of course, he left, as you know, Chuck, without talking to supporters. But what we saw was defiance from his legal team. We asked them repeatedly if he would commit to something that the judge raised, this issue of posting inflammatory comments on his social media account. They would not do that. I asked what their next move was. They wouldn't get specific about that. They said, we're just going to continue to fight this. So, Chuck, a lot remains unknown in terms of what happens next, but this was history unfolding here today. That's for sure. Let me go down to Mar-a-Lago, where the former president is on his way, and there we do expect a decent crowd of his supporters. Vaughn Hillyard, is it your understanding how open to the public is this going to be? How much of this is an invite-only list? How would you describe it?
It's about as open as Mar-a-Lago is ever. This is his private club. It's also his private residence. This is an invite-only event. You can see we just in the last 10 minutes got in here, Chuck, and you can see the number of chairs that they have allotted here. This is a campaign event. It's his campaign staff that is putting this on. He is set to deliver those remarks at 8:15 p.m. Eastern time in prime time. I think it's notable when we're looking at Donald Trump and what statements he is going to be making here. There was no gag order that was put in place here by the judge, meaning that Donald Trump here at this time is likely to speak, not only continuing his effort to undermine the credibility and undercut the reputation of District Attorney Alvin Bragg, but also the judge, Judge Merchan here, who over the last 24 hours, Donald Trump has repeatedly suggested is, quote, Trump hating, taking direct shots at even members of his own family. I think it's important whenever we say that, though, Chuck, that Donald Trump has a long history of doing that against anybody who has ever investigated him, attempted to prosecute him, or any judges that have overseen his case. This is not new out of his playbook here, but for Donald Trump, he will be here on later this evening. And I'll just say, you know, it was his own attorneys that fought having cameras in the courtroom here and for the criminal proceedings ahead. Of course, inside of a courtroom, Donald Trump, unless he takes a stand, can only control the messaging so much. But when he is here at a podium, a microphone at a campaign event, it's a whole different story, Chuck.
It is, but it'll be fascinating to watch his remarks tonight and see if we can glean whether you're thinking, if the judge hadn't admonished him, what would he have said in his remarks? But anyway, that'll be something for all of us to follow tonight. Vaughn, stick around for me here for a few minutes. Ken, before we get to our two legal experts here who have certainly written their share of indictments, I want to ask you, the difference between the indictment itself and the statement of facts, it's amazing how many statement of facts are not included in the indictment, or even alluded to in the indictment. The biggest thing being the Karen McDougal part and the American media, National Enquirer, and David Pecker. I mean, you read the statement of facts, and it looks like David Pecker might be the single most important witness they have, not Michael Cohen. You read the indictment, and you think Michael Cohen's the single most important witness they have. So have you ever seen something like this as a reporter covering the legal community?
Never, Chuck. And you put your finger right on the heart of this. This is an incredibly ambitious case, but it also appears to me to be a very challenging case. You're absolutely right. It's the statement of facts which has all the moral force. And let's face it, criminal justice is about right and wrong and ethics at the end of the day. And a lot of the outrage, if you're talking about the conduct that's being described here that maybe people could get mad about, it's in the statement of facts. It's described as a scheme to conceal these affairs from the voting public. But guess what? Bragg's not charging any of that as crimes. He's just using that conduct to elevate these business record falsification misdemeanors to felonies. And people are going to come in here and say, wait a second, you're alleging violations of federal campaign law, state campaign law, potentially New York State tax records, but you're not even saying which statutes are violated or whether, or naming the crimes. And so that is the sort of conundrum here at the heart of the case. They may ultimately have to do that as this thing proceeds, and they're going to be challenged on these points. But it's, you know, and the issue here is, are people really going to be that upset about falsified business records that never went anywhere? Probably not, right? But they are. Some people are going to be outraged that Trump paid people to kill damaging stories to hide that conduct during the election.
All right, so let me move to our two lawyers here in our conversation. Dan Horwitz, the former Manhattan District Attorney, Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. Attorney. Dan, let me start with you. You've worked in this office as an assistant district attorney. Square the statement of facts with the indictment. How unusual is this? How had you done something like that? Were you surprised that the allegation of conspiracy, which is certainly part of the narrative, it seems, is not actually in the indictment?
So it's not unusual over the last several years in Manhattan to have an indictment with a statement of facts. This goes back to Mr. Bragg's predecessor, I think Cy Vance, who was the former DA. He began doing it. I have several cases pending right now where I have indictments just like this one, bare bones, and I'll explain that that is not unusual in a state case to have a bare bones an indictment that simply tracks the law without a lot of facts. But the office has had a practice more recently of accompanying those kinds of indictments, especially in complex white-collar cases, with a statement of facts. Now, will the defendant have an opportunity legally to say, please spell out details in the indictment that are not there but that are in the statement of facts? Yes. In criminal and civil cases, federal and state, there's something called the Bill of Particulars. And that's something that a defendant will ask for as part of their motions. Please, District Attorney, provide me with a Bill of Particulars so we know what the particulars are behind the indictment. So that'll get spelled out for sure.
Chuck Rosenberg, is there a legal way that Donald Trump could claim all of this? Everything that they say is true. I was worried about my presidential campaign. Is the only part that made this illegal the falsifying of the business records or not?
As charged, yes. I mean, to Dan's point, there is more stuff that is alleged but not charged in the statement of facts. A scheme to conceal. It reads like a conspiracy, even though the word conspiracy isn't included in it. But if you're talking about what is Mr. Trump charged with, it's the falsification of business records. And each time that they made a payment through Michael Cohen to Stormy Daniels, it sort of affected another business record, a check, an invoice, a ledger, right? So they've taken a dozen or so instances of making a payment and charged it in almost 3 dozen different ways. By the way, I don't think that's unsound as a legal matter, but it's so interesting to me because at least in my federal practice, you would simply take the statement of facts and sort of merge it into the indictment.
Weave it in here, yeah.
Yeah, it would be one longer speaking indictment, but I respect that in New York State and particularly in Manhattan, they have a different procedure.
So, Dan, based on reading both the indictment and the statement of facts, would you assume that David Pecker of American media is perhaps the single most important witness for the district attorney and not Michael Cohen now?
Absolutely, Chuck. David Pecker clearly takes center stage. You've got specific allegations of several meetings, including a one-on-one dinner, I believe, that took place after defendant Trump was elected, but before he was inaugurated, where they specifically talked about one of the payoffs. There is no question that he is star witness. Yeah. And it is going to be very difficult for the president to attack the credibility of Michael Cohen if the jury hears the story from David Pecker as well, because then it's not just one person. And by the way, this is somebody who had sour grapes with me, who's interested in getting his name in the newspapers, and he wants to be a media star himself, and he was disgruntled, and whatever Donald Trump is going to do with Michael Cohen. It is very different when the publisher of the National Enquirer, who has done that job for decades, gets on the witness stand and said, yes, I had these conversations too, and not just one, but several.
Let me go down quickly to Vaughn Hillyard. I know you've got some other reporting to get to, but I'm very curious, Vaughn, how nervous is the Trump world about a discovery with David Pecker? I mean, this could now go to places he does not want to see go public.
Right. Suddenly the conversations around David Pecker that we're being enlightened to that happened during the transition at Trump Tower, but also during the time of his own presidency here, we're dealing with an individual, with a witness here who Donald Trump had viewed as a credible ally for so long. These are good questions. Let's be frank here. Trump's top campaign team are on the plane with him right now, coming back here to Florida. Right. Michael Cohen, Donald Trump, over the last 3 weeks, was working and doing his best to try to undercut the credibility of Michael Cohen. And that's where now suddenly you have a potential corroborating witness, which Michael Cohen kept repeatedly going back to, was that there was evidence that backed this up. Frankly, a lot of the evidence I don't believe that we have seen as a public here yet, or has been entered into this here. But for the campaign operation, that is, I think, why Donald Trump has a history of not getting to the facts. I asked him specific questions just 10 days ago when I was on his campaign plane about the Michael Cohen payments, of when he became familiar about the Stormy Daniels arrangement, and he continually sidestepped my questions. I asked him, if it wasn't for Stormy Daniels, what did you think you were paying Michael Cohen for? He sidestepped the question again and told me I had no further questions to ask him. And so this is somebody who has always sort of weaseled his way around answering specific questions, which really goes to the heart of the question. Was he aware? Was he not?
Yeah, and this is what fascinates me about having David Pecker as such an important witness. Chuck Rosenberg, David Pecker's relationship with Donald Trump goes back years. There are all sorts of, I guess the question I have is, there's all sorts of historical schemes that they've done together that have been alleged in the past. How relevant, and could that stuff end up going on the stand? And the reason I ask, is there a way that Trump's attorneys could keep Pecker from not talking about other stuff?
Well, so you're talking about a rule of evidence in the federal system. It's Rule 404B. It's called prior bad acts, and New York State has an analogous rule. So the notion is that if you've done a lot of bad things in the past, Chuck, but you're on trial for something else, can prosecutors pour that other bad stuff into the trial in front of the jury to say, Chuck's a bad guy, look at all this other stuff. Right. So prosecutors have to use it for to show intent, to show pattern, to show absence of mistake, to show motive. If those other bad acts connect in some way to the current charges, then prosecutors will typically be permitted to adduce it. And if it doesn't, then they won't.
Dan, you're a defense attorney now. Would you be advising your client to make a plea and get out of this?
Well, if he wasn't the former president of the United States who's thinking about running for president again, I absolutely would be. But look, I mean, in all seriousness, and that's important to keep in mind, which is that there are certain people that you represent where they cannot plead guilty. And it's not a question of whether or not you have a defense. It's you've got to go to trial because of your position, because of your prominence, because you are in a position of power and importance, whether that's in a company or somewhere else, or you're the former president. So I just don't think that's I don't think that's a realistic scenario here. And look, I mean, let's just be honest here. These are serious charges. But in New York's scheme of criminal laws, they are the lowest level felony. And the question becomes, if the president was to go to trial and get convicted, would he be sentenced to jail? And I think that anybody under these circumstances with a low-level felony with no prior criminal record there's a pretty good chance that they're not going to go to jail. And so there's a lot of reasons why for this particular individual, going to trial is the only option.
Very quickly, Ken Dilanian, 30 seconds. We got the E. Jean Carroll trial, the Atlanta indictment. If we don't see it in a couple of months, are we not going to see it?
That's a good bet, but I think the Mar-a-Lago case is really picking up steam.
That's moving.
Chuck.
Okay.
The federal documents case, that's the one to watch right now.
All right. And Kristen Welker, again, I go back. I just know the way Donald Trump thinks. David Pecker being the key witness here has got to have him more nervous than ever because the politics of what Pecker knows could be real problematic for him, both in his own personal life, but also his professional life.
There's no doubt, Chuck, you are now talking about a broader set of facts and potential circumstances that could be underlying these 34 felony counts. And so, look, again, I think you saw the weight of this on Mr. Trump's face when he was sitting in that courtroom. And, of course, the uncertainty of the politics of all of this. What will this mean for his presidential campaign? We've really seen Republicans close ranks around him right now. But if there are more indictments, Chuck, I'm told that could change, that his rivals could start to argue this is baggage. And this goes back to a point that you and I have been talking about, which is who is the voter who voted for Trump in 2016, voted for Biden in 2020? How does he win that person back?
Yeah, hard to imagine that this indictment gets somehow a voter back that he lost. But then again, we had suspended logic in our staff meetings for years and years. Kristen Welker, Ken Dilanian, Chuck Rosenberg, Dan Horwitz, and before that, Vaughn Hillyard. Thank you all for this truncated version to get us smarter about what we all witnessed today.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.